call. Thanks for having me on, Alex.
You bet. It's been about 2 or 3 years since I had you on last. I want to do it at least once a year, not every 3 years. It's good to have you here with us. You're hearing us have this discussion of banking systems, of fractional reserve banking, of why gold and oil and silver is exploding. It's because they're not up. It's just the dollar's down. That value is still the same. You want to comment on that?
Well, the whole problem extends from government. If you didn't have government, then the Federal Reserve and systems and the manipulation of the monetary system, if you will, couldn't take place. It's only because of government that you have such abuses. You take government out of the picture, and in a voluntary society, you can have a bunch of idiots put worthless piece of paper on the market, and people would be able to either accept it or not, and obviously, idiots like that will go out of business. But it's because of government, and government is the base problem.
Well, I agree with you. The problem is that they've confused all the terms. Now, of the 100 biggest economies, 40-plus of them, 44 of them, are corporations. They're acting in a governmental way, and then fake conservatives confuse people and go, oh, yeah, we agree with Marc Stevens. We want privatization, hand everything over to them, but then they just operate as governments.
Well, corporations have the same. The reason why corporations do what they're doing
is chartered by the
government does.
Yeah.
They're chartered by government. They have no personal accountability. Usually, there's almost no personal liability whatsoever. Occasionally, you'll get something where they so-called pierce the corporate veil, but they typically don't. They work hand in hand with government to, of course, plunder and rape people.
And I want to start. I've kind of brought us to the end here at the start. Start with how you woke up, who you are. Tell us about your book, and then I want to first get into just the insane criminality of the courts. I mean, here's one example. After you tell us about yourself, for those who don't know who you are, who've been hiding under a rock. 2 weeks ago, Rocky Mountain News, state judge says, I don't care if this 16-year-old didn't break a law, photographing himself with a gun just because his dad's a gun collector, and then someone saw the picture. It doesn't matter if he's allowed to have the gun in his house. It doesn't matter if he didn't threaten anybody. He's been in jail for 2 months. I'm convicting and keeping him in jail for years, and the judge just says, I don't need a law anymore to put you in jail. Or people aren't even indicted or charged yet in the case of them arresting 2, quote, drug dealers, and they're taking them to the dentist to rip out their gold fillings out of their mouth, their gold crowns. I mean, again, trying to steal people's teeth before even charges have been made. Are those not 2 examples of government total criminality? Bush saying he's above the law on torture, Bush saying he's above the law on the NSA, Bush saying he's above the law. He signed a bill a month ago that hadn't even passed, a $2 billion spending bill. I mean, we've entered Twilight Zone la-la land. Go ahead.
Well, it's the above-the-law mentality that led me to realize there was no state and that there is no such thing as a legitimate government ever. Because I was researching into this absolute immunity that judges are supposed to have. And when I found cases like I quote in the book, Bowers versus Vito, and there's hundreds of these, that the government has no duty to protect anybody. Whether it's state, local, federal, it doesn't matter. No duty to protect. And I look at, the only thing that makes somebody a citizen is the duty of allegiance in return for a duty of protection, that they're reciprocal obligations. Well, if there's no duty to protect, it struck me that there's no duty of allegiance. There are no citizens. And the whole thing started to collapse from there. And I've gone into court, and based on that information, not that I've gone into court with I know a lot of people that go in and they understand that the state doesn't exist, it's a fiction. I don't take a position. I would go in and ask a simple question such as, is there evidence of a complaining party, which is a standard legal question, and not one prosecutor, judge, lawyer, or cop, none of them would actually say yes or no to me.
Well, before we get into all these legal theories and ideas, which I agree with you on most of your stances on your research, go back to how Marc Stevens woke up.
Well, not to go into too big a case, I was in a traffic case for failure to produce identification, which that tells you right there you've got a serious problem, that you're not in a free society.
Hundreds of times federal and state courts have ruled you don't have to ID, but still they arrest people every day for it.
Well, you have Brown versus Texas. Brown versus Texas makes it clear, unanimous Supreme Court decision, you don't have to show police identification unless there's probable cause that you are engaged in a crime.
And that's an Austin, Texas case.
Yeah, and it's 9-0. Go ask any legal scholar, any lead constitutional lawyer, someone who follows the Supreme Court. How many 9-0 decisions are there from the U.S. Supreme Court? There's only a handful. So they ignore it. And so what happened was I read Brown versus, I impeached all 5 police officers against me. that testified. The judge said you've impeached all your witnesses. They're a bunch of liars. He still convicted me, and I figured, well, the last thing I have is Brown versus Texas, and I read it, and the guy sneers down at me. That's your interpretation. And I was floored. I didn't know where else to go. So what happened was, because of that, I started looking at any situation where this guy with the robe on has discretion. Now, discretion means literally he can do whatever he wants. Okay? And it's the worst word you want to hear if you're in a court case, I think, in my opinion. Anyway,
yeah, the court's discretion. And did you see the case 2 weeks ago? I see one every day now where they go, no one was found guilty, but you're going to jail. How many people know the Davidians in 94 were found not guilty by the jury, but Walter E. Smith said, I'm putting you all in jail for 47 years. He said, I find you guilty for using firearms in the commission of murder when they were found not guilty for murder.
Yeah, they were acquitted on all the charges of murder, that it was self-defense. And yes, and it's happened here in Phoenix, and it's happened a lot of places, because especially a tax case. There's a famous case here out of Phoenix where a man sued Smitty's on his own, won a huge jury settlement, and the judge stood up, not in my court. And I actually saw the order from the judge, and it said, what a tangled web we weave when unto a lawyer we fail to cleave. And even though the judge was censored by the Arizona Supreme Court, they never reversed or gave him back his jury decision.
So I want people to hear us loud and clear. People are going to jail, and the judge says no law's been violated, but I'm sending you to prison. That is dictatorship.
Well, it gets even worse than that, and I don't know how much time we have in the segment. What I started looking at was the whole basis of government and the whole basis for the government to bring a case against you. Even if you, let's say you have drugs and the law says you're not supposed to have drugs, or you're supposed to file a tax return and the law says you're supposed to file a tax return. Even if they can show that, they still don't have a case against you or have standing to complain against you in court. I explain this in my seminars at length. Because you're talking, if you look at the Stanford prison experiment, and I agree with you about the prison planet, and what I discuss is how the whole world is one big Stanford prison experiment, where you've got billions of people pretending to be citizens and residents of non-existent states and countries, and you've got a few million people, a couple 100 million people, pretending to be senators and presidents and congressmen and whatnot. And if you go through that experiment, it explains why people let's say in the United States, so-called, can't get away from this theology called government.
And we have a multiple, doctorate psychologist here. For those that don't know what the Stanford experiment was, tell them in a nutshell. Well, obviously, in a nutshell, Mark, you tell them.
Well, what happened was, in a nutshell, it was a psychological experiment conducted. It was supposed to be 2 weeks long, where they were doing a mock prison. Half a group of young men were going to pretend to be prisoners. The other half were going to pretend to be prison guards. They had to stop the experiment within 6 days because the psychiatrist doing the experiment said that the guards were becoming sadistic. He also had what was called de-individuation within 36 hours. Because what that means, in a nutshell, is that the people pretending to be prisoners, who knew they were pretending, this is extremely critical, they knew they were pretending and lost their personal identity. They could only identify themselves as part of the collective group of prisoners. And that's what you have, where people cannot identify themselves as other than citizens or residents of the United States or Texas or whatnot.
There was another famous case where they had them practice giving them electric shocks, but told them in a double-blind study you're actually going to kill somebody, and they would follow the orders to kill.
That was the Milgram experiment, and I have that link on my website, and I use those two experiments together to explain the nature and basis of government and the psychological basis, why people cannot accept the truth. And what you were speaking with the doctor before the break, before I came on, about the cognitive dissonance, that it doesn't fit the paradigm. People cannot identify. They have a very difficult time accepting that there is no state, there is no United States, there is no such thing as a president, and there are no citizens. And that's because of the de-individuation. They've been pretending that they're citizens for so long, they can't grasp the truth that they are just Alex Jones or they're just Marc Stevens, and the whole thing that they've been scammed their entire lives. And these two experiments give you the psychological basis for that. Why is it possible for George Bush and all these other people to murder 3,000 people? Well, if you look at the Stanford prison experiment, within 6 days of controlling other men and women, okay, you become sadistic. You don't see them as human beings anymore. And that's why it's possible to do that. That explains the whole psychological nature, that it is very possible.
And by the way, it is almost unknown in history for governments not to mass murder and slaughter and go totally nuts. It's the very nature of sickos that get into control.
Well, that's
because a normal person doesn't have an appetite to continually, try to exert power.
Well, I'm glad you said normal, because you're absolutely right, because government is just a gang of killers, thieves, and liars. And another host of GCN had asked me, didn't the Founding Fathers at least have good intentions? And I said, well, I don't care what their intentions are, but I would say no, because the one question you need to ask about their intentions is this: were the services of protection, which is the only legitimate basis of government was to protect, which of course they don't, were their services provided on a voluntary basis? No. Anybody who's willing to kill you in order to protect you is not normal. And that's why government can never be legitimate, and that's why government cannot be restricted.
Well,